The paper was shaking in my hands, not from the wind, but from rage. They called it a violation notice. I called it an obituary for the last piece of peace I had left in my life. It was the kind of morning that used to make me believe everything would be okay. The grass was still wet from the night rain, and the air smelled faintly of honeysuckle from the fence line. The world was quiet, just the distant hum of a lawn mower, a barking dog somewhere down the block. I stepped outside with my coffee, still in my robe, half awake, half dreaming. That's when I saw it, a sheet of paper taped crookedly to my front door, flapping in the soft wind like a flag I never agreed to raise. The red letters at the top made my stomach twist before I even read them. Notice of violation. At first I thought it was a mistake. Maybe they mixed up the addresses. Maybe it was meant for the house next door. But as I peeled the paper off the glass and began to read, my hands started to tremble. They weren't shaking because I was cold. They were shaking because I could feel something being taken from me, and it wasn't just a piece of paper. According to the notice, I was in violation of Cedar Ridge HOA Code 4.7b, unauthorized decorative lawn fixtures. My offense? A small garden gnome that sat near the edge of my flower bed, tucked beneath the rose bushes, exactly where my father had placed it 5 years ago. The letter was formal, sterile, and merciless. You are hereby instructed to remove said decoration within 7 days or face escalating fines and legal enforcement action. Below that, stamped neatly in blue ink, was the name Greg Thompson, HOA president. I'd seen Greg around before. He was the kind of man who looked like he'd been born in a polo shirt. Always too tan, always too sure of himself, always talking about property values as if they were sacred scripture. He waved at people the same way politicians did, like every motion was practiced in a mirror. The first time he'd come to my door months ago, it had been to remind me that my grass was half an inch too tall. He said it with a smile, but his eyes never smiled with him. Now, reading his signature at the bottom of this notice, that same smile burned in my memory. I looked at the gnome sitting quietly in the garden. Its paint had faded over the years, the little red hat chipped in places, but to me it was perfect. My father had carved it himself long before he passed. He'd been a Vietnam veteran, a man who never talked much about the war, but always found peace in the soil. He used to say carving helped him forget what he'd seen over there. When he gave me that gnome, he said, "It'll keep watch when I can't." And now some man in khakis and authority thought he had the right to erase it with a notice and a fine. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the sprinklers hiss and the neighborhood dogs bark. The sound of normal life, suddenly mocking. I imagined Greg writing that letter, straightening his tie, believing he was keeping the neighborhood uniform, believing power made him right. Anger slowly replaced disbelief. My father fought for this country, for freedom, and now I was being told that even my front yard had to obey someone else's taste. I walked back inside and set the notice on my kitchen counter, beside the framed photo of my dad, him in uniform, squinting into the sun, a faint grin on his face. The contrast between that photo and the paper beside it made something in me snap. I could feel the heat rise behind my eyes, that quiet, focused kind of anger that doesn't burn out. I read the notice again, every line like a taunt. The words "remove immediately" stood out as if they were shouting. My father's voice echoed in the back of my mind, something he used to tell me when life cornered him. They only win when you stop standing. That was the moment I stopped feeling powerless. I picked up the paper again, folded it neatly, almost respectfully, and slid it into a drawer. Then I stepped outside, walked over to the gnome, and wiped a bit of dirt off its hat. "Don't worry," I whispered. "You're not going anywhere." The morning breeze carried a faint laugh from across the street. I looked up to see Greg standing near his driveway, clipboard in hand, pretending not to watch me. The smirk on his face told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about the gnome. It was about control. I held his stare just long enough to make him look away first. That's when I knew. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. But that letter wasn't just a warning, it was Greg Thompson's declaration of war. They said it was just a statue. But to me, it was the only voice my father had left. After Greg's notice, I tried to tell myself it wasn't worth losing sleep over. But that night, as I passed the kitchen window and saw the little gnome half hidden under the moonlight, I couldn't stop thinking about my father's hands, the way they used to tremble when he carved the final details into its face. He'd made it after beating cancer. He said it gave him something to focus on, something that wasn't chemo or doctors or the smell of hospitals. I remember sitting on the porch, 12 years old, watching him work under a single hanging light. He carved quietly, almost reverently, as if every chip of wood he removed took a piece of pain away with it. When he finished, he painted it by hand, red hat, blue coat, white beard, and laughed like he hadn't in years. He placed it in the center of his garden and said, "He'll keep watch when I can't." He died 3 years later. And after we sold his house, that gnome was the only thing I took. Not the tools, not the old medals, not even the photo albums. Just that small, smiling figure that felt like his voice frozen in time. When I moved into Cedar Ridge, I placed it by my roses, because that's where the light hit just right. It became my anchor, my reminder that peace could exist in small things. So when Greg called it non-compliant decor, it wasn't just insulting, it was cruel. By the second day, I could already feel the whispers. People slowed their walks when they passed my house. Some smiled politely, others looked away. One neighbor, a woman named Diane, told me quietly that the board doesn't like when people resist. She said it like a warning. Then the fines started. First, $50, then $100, then a new letter that said continuing non-compliance may result in lien action. I read every line 3 times, hands tightening around the page. They were treating my father's memory like a parking violation. That's when I opened the HOA's bylaws, something most homeowners never bother to read. Section 4.7b, Decorative Lawn Features. Permitted if under 3 feet in height, not disruptive to neighborhood uniformity. I grabbed a measuring tape. 2.5 feet. Exactly. I wasn't breaking a single rule. So the next morning, when Greg knocked on my door, clipboard in hand, I was ready. He didn't bother to greet me properly, just that practiced smile. "Good morning, Ms. Harper. I wanted to follow up about your decorative piece." "Gnome," I said. "It has a name." He ignored the correction, glancing toward the garden. "You understand we have to maintain a consistent community aesthetic. It's not personal, it's just regulation." I stepped out onto the porch, crossing my arms. "According to your own bylaws, anything under 3 feet is permitted. Mine's 2.5. Greg's jaw twitched for a second. Then he gave a thin smile. "Rules are rules, Ms. Harper, but interpretation is part of enforcement." That sentence hung in the air like smoke. "Interpretation," I repeated. "So you make the rules, and then you get to decide what they mean?" He shifted uncomfortably, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "We have a vision for Cedar Ridge. Uniformity keeps property values high." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "You're talking about numbers on a spreadsheet. I'm talking about my father." For the first time, he looked slightly unsettled, but only for a moment. Then the smile returned, sharper than before. "I understand this is emotional for you, but we can't make exceptions. If we let one person bend the rules, everyone will." I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just stared at him until his confident expression began to crack. Finally, I said, "Then maybe it's time someone reminded you that homeowners still have rights." Greg's smile faded. "You can take it up with the board, Ms. Harper. But until then, I expect that gnome gone by Friday." He turned and walked away, his shoes clicking against the pavement like a metronome counting down the days I had left. As I watched him disappear down the street, something shifted inside me. I realized Greg wasn't fighting for order. He was fighting for power, the kind that comes from making people kneel just because you can. And in that moment, I made a quiet promise to myself. If he wanted obedience, he'd have to earn it. That's when I realized Greg wasn't enforcing rules. He was enforcing obedience. By the third notice, I stopped counting the fines. I started counting how many times Greg's car drove past my window. After that conversation on the porch, something in the air around my house changed. It wasn't sudden, like a storm breaking. It was slow, creeping, quiet, like the moment before thunder, when you can feel the pressure in your chest but can't see where it's coming from. The next morning, there was another envelope in my mailbox. White paper, the same neat font, same logo of Cedar Ridge Estates. Violation update. Continuing non-compliance. $50. The following day, another one, this time $75. I hadn't even left the house, and somehow I was breaking new rules every 24 hours. By the third notice, I stopped opening them right away. I'd just slide them into a pile on the kitchen counter, right next to the coffee pot, like little trophies from a war I hadn't agreed to fight. But the sight of that growing stack gnawed at me. Every envelope was a reminder that someone was watching, tracking, documenting, waiting. I started noticing Greg's silver SUV more often. It wasn't paranoia. I could recognize the vanity plate anywhere, CDE HOA 1. He'd drive by slowly, pretending to check his phone, pretending not to stare. Once I saw him stop in front of my house, step out, and make a note on his clipboard before getting back in the car. It felt less like oversight and more like surveillance. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that if I just lived my life, if I didn't give him a reason to escalate, maybe he'd move on. But by the end of that week, 2 more inspection notices arrived, stating that a board member had observed continued decorative violations. Observed. That word stuck out like a bruise. I hadn't seen anyone come near the property, which meant they were coming when I wasn't looking. The first night it happened, I was in the living room, half watching TV when I heard the sound, a soft metallic click, like a camera shutter, right outside the front window. I froze. The lights were low, and for a moment I thought I imagined it. Then I saw it again. Brief, a flash of white against the dark. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. No one there. Just the quiet hum of crickets and the faint smell of rain. But my heart wouldn't slow down. I locked the door, checked the windows twice, and sat up until almost 2 a.m., waiting for that sound to return. It didn't. Not that night. Over the next few days, I started feeling the walls close in. The phone would ring once and stop. A neighbor, across the street, someone who used to wave every morning, suddenly avoided eye contact. Another neighbor crossed to the other side of the sidewalk when she saw me watering the plants. It was subtle, but isolating. Word spreads fast in communities like Cedar Ridge, and Greg knew exactly how to use that. Every HOA meeting, every newsletter, every whisper that made me sound like a troublemaker, it was all part of the same machine. He didn't have to raise his voice or make threats. He just had to make me feel alone. I stopped sitting on the porch in the evenings. I started keeping the blinds half closed, not because I was hiding, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from somewhere. Even the smallest noises, a branch tapping against the siding, the clang of the mailbox lid, made me flinch. The one person who dared speak to me was Diane. One evening, she knocked softly and said, "Claire, be careful. Greg's telling people you're trying to sue the board." I laughed, but it came out hollow. Sue them? I'm just trying to keep my father's statue in the ground. She hesitated, lowering her voice. That's how it starts. He picks one person, makes an example. After that, nobody fights back. After she left, I stood at the window for a long time, staring out into the dark. The streetlights buzzed softly, moths circling around them like lost souls. I realized then how effective Greg's strategy really was. He didn't need to break my door down. He just needed to make me feel like a prisoner inside my own home. Still, there was a strange kind of power in knowing exactly what he was doing. Fear began to harden into something else, something heavier, sharper. I decided I wouldn't move the gnome, not an inch. Every fine, every letter, every drive-by, it all became proof, evidence. By the end of that month, the pile of notices was thick enough to fill a folder. My voice of defiance had become quiet, but steady. Each envelope, each photograph he took was a brick in the wall he was building around me. And one day soon, I planned to tear it down from the inside. Then, one night, while closing the blinds in my living room, I caught a movement outside. A faint rustle near the porch. I turned off the lights and peered through the gap. A figure crouched by the rose bushes, camera in hand, the lens glinting under the porch light. My breath caught. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the steady beat of my heart and the faint click of the shutter. Then one night, I caught someone crouched near my porch, camera in hand. You know corruption when you see it. It smells like fertilizer and sounds like fake laughter at an HOA meeting. After catching that shadow with the camera, I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside made me jolt upright, but fear slowly turned into calculation. If Greg wanted to intimidate me, he'd made a mistake. I'd spent enough nights awake to know how to watch quietly. By the next week, I'd stopped reacting to every new notice. Instead, I started keeping them organized. Dates, times, reasons, fines, all neatly filed. I didn't know what I was going to do with them yet, but I knew they were evidence of something bigger than a lawn dispute. The next HOA meeting was in the community clubhouse, a place that smelled like bleach and artificial pine. Greg stood at the front, his usual grin stretched across his face as he talked about maintaining our standards. The board members laughed at every line he delivered, like a chorus of well-trained parrots. I sat near the back, pretending to take notes while my recorder app ran quietly in my purse. That's when I started noticing small details, things that didn't add up. Greg mentioned the neighborhood's mandatory landscape compliance program, something that hadn't existed in last year's bylaws. He said all future yard work must be handled by Cedar Ridge Landscaping, the HOA's approved vendor. The way he said approved stuck in my mind. After the meeting, I approached one of the newer board members, a man named Ben who looked uneasy whenever Greg spoke. That landscaping company, I asked casually, how do they become approved? He hesitated, glancing toward Greg across the room. It's just part of the board's preferred partnership policy, he said finally. Then in a whisper, don't ask too many questions, Claire. It won't help. That was all I needed to hear. That night, I started digging. It didn't take long. The company's website was plain. Cheap logo, no staff listed. But a few clicks deeper, the ownership details showed a name that made my stomach turn. Paul Becker, Greg's brother-in-law. I sat there staring at the screen, the glow of the laptop washing the room in pale light. It all made sense now. The fines, the push for uniformity, the letters about approved maintenance. They were funneling homeowners into using Greg's relative's company. And anyone who resisted, like me, was punished until they paid or left. I printed everything. Company documents, HOA minutes, even screenshots of Greg's emails about increasing vendor compliance. The deeper I looked, the worse it got. Every fine, every inspection, every rule, they were building a profit structure hidden under the language of community. I started reading up on HOA law, the parts most homeowners never see. That's when I found it. Failure to disclose financial relationships constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty. It was one line in a sea of legal text, but it felt like a lifeline. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had ground to stand on. Still, I knew what I was doing was dangerous, at least socially. Greg ruled Cedar Ridge with polite intimidation. People feared him because he didn't shout. He smiled. And those smiles had cost homeowners thousands. A few days later, I drove by a house at the end of the street, a property that had recently sold. The new lawn looked identical to every other one on the block. Same pattern, same bushes, same contractor sign. I realized then that approved didn't just mean chosen, it meant owned. When I got home, I started keeping a journal. Every call, every visit, every time Greg's car idled outside my driveway, I wrote it down. Each page was a reminder that I wasn't crazy, that this wasn't just about a gnome, it was about greed wearing a neighbor's smile. The next HOA newsletter arrived 2 days later. Buried between community announcements was a new policy update. Non-compliant homeowners may be subject to foreclosure proceedings if fines remain unpaid. I read the line twice, the words blurring for a second. Then I looked out the window. Greg's SUV was parked across the street again, his silhouette faint behind the windshield. For a moment, the world felt unnervingly quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I turned back to the paper, the smell of fresh ink sharp in the air. My fingers tightened around it until it crumpled slightly, and the next morning, I found a notice saying they'd start foreclosure if I didn't comply. I realized if they could weaponize rules, I could weaponize silence and stone. The morning I found the foreclosure notice taped to my door, something inside me went very still. Not broken, just quiet. It was the kind of silence that happens when anger hardens into purpose. I stood there on the porch, holding that paper, reading the words over and over until they stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like a challenge. Greg wanted obedience. He wanted me to bend, to apologize, to fall in line like everyone else. But fear had done its job. It had burned out, leaving behind something sharper. I wasn't going to argue with him anymore. I wasn't going to write letters or beg for fairness. I was going to speak in a language he couldn't control. That night, I went into the garage. It smelled like dust and old oil, the air heavy with heat. I pulled the tarp off my father's old workbench, the one thing I'd never sold after he passed. It still had a few of his tools on it, worn handles smoothed by years of use. Among them was a chisel, small but solid, the same one he'd used when carving the gnome. I turned it over in my hand, and for the first time since all this began, I smiled. I dragged an old slab of stone from the corner of the garage, set it on the workbench, and ran my fingers across its surface. Cold. Rough. Unforgiving. Perfect. I didn't plan what I was going to make that night. I just started carving. Every tap of the hammer was a heartbeat. Every chip that felt like a release. I carved through the hours until the first light of morning crept through the garage window, painting the dust in gold. By then, I knew exactly what I was doing. If Greg wanted to dictate what beauty looked like, I'd show him what his kind of order really looked like, immortalized in stone. I started with him. I remembered every detail, the crisp collars, the polished shoes, the tight, disapproving mouth. But I didn't carve him as he wanted to be seen. I carved him as he truly was. Self-righteous, smug, his chin lifted as if he could smell money in the air. His hand was clutching a clipboard like a weapon. When I stepped back, I felt something strange. Relief. The fear that had wrapped itself around my chest for weeks started to loosen. I wasn't powerless anymore. The hammer and chisel had become my defense. From then on, the garage became my world. I worked late into the night, the sound of metal striking stone echoing through the empty street. Sometimes I'd stop just to listen, to the rhythm of my breathing, the rasp of the chisel, the wind outside. The air was thick with dust, but I didn't mind. It smelled like creation. It smelled like defiance. Every figure I made after that had meaning. One board member was carved with a finger pointing, another with a hand in a pocket full of stones shaped like dollar signs. I wasn't just sculpting faces. I was sculpting truth. Their hypocrisy, their greed, their small-minded hunger for power. It was all right there, permanent and cold. There was something poetic about it. They used paperwork and bylaws to control people, but paper burns and signatures fade. Stone endures. At first, I thought I was doing it for my father, for the principle of it, for justice. But the deeper I went, the more I realized I was doing it for myself. Every strike of the hammer was a way to reclaim something Greg had tried to take. My peace, my home, my dignity. By the third statue, the work stopped feeling like anger and started feeling like freedom. I didn't care if anyone ever saw them. They weren't revenge. They were confession. Every line and edge held my exhaustion, my rage, my stubbornness. Sometimes I imagined Greg seeing them, walking past row after row of his own likenesses, each one frozen in the act of enforcing his precious rules. I imagined the silence that would fall over him, the way the weight of truth would finally press against that hollow pride. But I wasn't ready for anyone to see them yet. Not even Diane, who'd started checking on me again, quietly dropping by with coffee and cautious looks. "You've been up all night again," she said once, her eyes drifting toward the garage door. "What are you working on?" "Something that's going to outlast every letter Greg ever sent me," I said. And I meant it. The nights blurred together. The sound of chiseling became my lullaby. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the garage window and barely recognize myself. Hair tied back, arms covered in gray dust, eyes wide and steady. I'd gone from frightened homeowner to quiet sculptor of truth. When I finished Greg's statue, I wiped the dust off its face and stared into those cold stone eyes. For the first time, I saw him for what he really was: small, fragile, temporary. That realization should have felt satisfying. Instead, it felt dangerous, like crossing a line I couldn't come back from. I shut off the light, stepped outside, and leaned against the cool night air. The neighborhood was silent, not a dog barking, not a leaf moving. Then, as I turned to close the garage door, a pair of headlights swung around the corner and stopped right in front of my driveway. They stayed there, idling, washing the stone face of Greg's statue in white light. When I finished the first one, headlights stopped outside my garage. You can tell who fears the HOA by how quickly they close their blinds when you walk by. After that night, the headlights, the silent watcher outside my garage, the neighborhood never felt the same again. I started noticing how the air itself seemed to tighten when I walked down the street. Some neighbors smiled stiffly, pretending nothing had changed. Others turned their backs or suddenly found something fascinating about their lawns. Fear had become part of the landscape here, like the manicured hedges or the matching mailboxes. You could see it in the way people lived. Quiet, cautious, obedient. But I wasn't quiet anymore. By now, Greg had seen enough of my defiance to make it personal. The very next week, I started receiving new violation letters that bordered on absurd: weeds exceeding half an inch, improper mailbox color, unauthorized modification to property exterior. He even fined me for obstructing community harmony. I remember laughing when I read that one, though there wasn't any humor in it. The fines weren't about money anymore. They were about control. It was a test. How much pressure could one woman handle before she broke? Some nights I'd see Diane watching from her porch, giving me a small nod of support. She was one of the few who didn't hide behind drawn curtains. "You're scaring him," she said one evening when she came over with coffee. "He's used to people folding." "Then he picked the wrong person," I told her. Still, the tension was starting to spread. The neighborhood was splitting cleanly down the middle. On one side were the loyalists, the ones who believed Greg kept order, who whispered that I was bringing down property values. On the other side were the silent ones, the ones who didn't agree with Greg but wouldn't dare say so out loud. You could tell who they were by the way they'd pause when walking past my house, giving me a subtle nod before moving on quickly. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be routine, but it felt more like a trial. Greg stood at the podium, his smile sharper than ever, his voice dripping with fake civility. "We've had several ongoing violations," he began, looking directly at me though he never said my name. "Certain residents have chosen not to comply, despite multiple reminders. This board is considering stronger measures." I raised my hand before he could continue. "Excuse me, Greg, but according to the HOA bylaws, you can't fine someone without a formal hearing. Section 5.4a. Residents must be given notice and an opportunity to present their case. You've skipped that step every single time." The room went quiet. For a moment, even Greg looked caught off guard. Then he smiled, a slow, practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Harper," he said, his tone soft but condescending. "We're all neighbors here. Surely we can resolve this without hiding behind technicalities." I leaned forward slightly. "You mean laws?" A few people actually chuckled. Greg's jaw tightened. If you'd like to schedule a hearing, we can certainly accommodate that, he said. But until then, your fines stand. It was a small victory, but it mattered. For the first time, people were seeing cracks in his control. I could feel the shift, the murmurs, the sidelong glances. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to see what I saw. A man who didn't protect the neighborhood. He policed it. After the meeting, Ben, the younger board member who always looked uneasy, caught up with me in the parking lot. You're right, he said quietly. About the hearings, about all of it. But be careful. Greg doesn't lose gracefully. I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. I'm not the one who started this, I said. That night, I sat in my garage again, looking at the statues lined up in the corner like silent witnesses. The figures stood under a single bulb, their stone faces half lit, half shadowed. It was strange how much comfort I found in them now. Each one represented a truth Greg couldn't silence. Each one was proof that fear didn't always win. For the first time, I felt like the balance of power was shifting. Greg's authority was no longer unquestioned. People were whispering about his behavior, questioning his motives. The empire of fear he'd built on fine print and intimidation was starting to crack. But Greg must have sensed it too, because he didn't wait long to strike back. The following afternoon, just as I stepped outside to water the roses, I saw his silver SUV roll slowly down the street. It stopped at the edge of my driveway. Greg got out, his smile gone this time. And when he opened the passenger door, my heart dropped. A uniformed police officer stepped out beside him, hand resting casually on his belt. Then Greg showed up at my driveway with a police image. Officer, nothing chills your blood like the sound of a police radio outside your home, especially when you've done nothing wrong. Greg's SUV idled in my driveway like a shadow that wouldn't leave. The hum of the engine mixed with the faint crackle of a police radio, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was dreaming. But dreams don't come with flashing blue lights. I stepped forward, still clutching the garden hose, water spilling onto the concrete and running toward Greg's polished shoes. He didn't flinch. The officer beside him, a tall man in his early 40s with tired eyes, watched quietly, his hand resting on the strap of his vest. Ms. Harper? The officer asked, his tone even. We received a complaint from the HOA about a possible public nuisance. Some concern about unauthorized structures and, potential safety hazards. I let out a short, humorless laugh. You mean the statues, I said. Greg crossed his arms, his voice smug but carefully polite. Officer, several residents have expressed discomfort. These displays are not in compliance with our neighborhood standards. The officer gave a small nod but didn't take his eyes off me. Would you mind if I take a quick look, ma'am? Just to confirm there's no hazard? Go ahead, I said. You're welcome to look at all 50 of them. Greg blinked. 50? I smiled faintly. You didn't think I'd stop at one, did you? The officer followed me around the side of the house, his boots crunching on gravel. The statues stood in neat rows under the garage light, silent and still, their stone faces cast in half shadow. The air smelled of dust and rain. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he exhaled softly. There. Something, he murmured. You made these yourself? Everyone, I said, brushing my hand against the cool surface of the nearest figure, Greg's likeness, captured mid-gesture, clipboard in hand, mouth half open as if issuing another fine. He crouched slightly, running his fingers along the edge of a sculpture. These aren't violations, Ms. Harper. Not from where I stand. They're art. Behind us, Greg's voice carried through the night. Art or not, they create a hostile atmosphere. This is harassment. The officer straightened and turned to him. Mr. Thompson, the HOA doesn't have jurisdiction to determine what's art. I'm here to make sure there's no criminal issue. From what I see, there isn't. Greg's smile was brittle now. This community is built on cooperation and standards, officer. You can't just allow one homeowner to disrupt that. The officer glanced at me, then back at him. Sir, unless there's vandalism, trespassing, or a safety threat, this isn't a police matter. It's civil. Greg's jaw tightened. She's mocking the board. I stepped forward then, my voice calm but sharp. No, Greg, I'm reflecting it. There's a difference. The officer's eyes flicked between us. You could almost see the thought forming behind his tired expression. Two people locked in a power struggle, one hiding behind paperwork, the other holding her ground with nothing but stubborn resolve. He gave me a small nod. You've got quite the sense of humor, Miss Harper, he said quietly. I had to, I replied. It's the only way to stay sane around here. Greg turned away in disgust, muttering something about filing further reports. The officer watched him go, then lowered his voice. Look, I shouldn't say this, but between you and me, HOAs can make life miserable. Still, they can't take criminal action without due process. You keep records, right? I pointed toward the folder on my porch table, thick with letters and printed bylaws. Every single one. He smiled faintly. Good. Just be careful. Power like his doesn't like being mocked in daylight. For a second, neither of us spoke. The rain started again, soft and steady, tapping against the stone faces like applause. Greg climbed into his SUV, slamming the door harder than necessary. The taillights flared red as he sped down the street, leaving a line of wet pavement in his wake. The officer walked back toward his patrol car, pausing by the open door. For what it's worth, he said, glancing back at the garage. Those are pretty damn accurate. I laughed for the first time in days. That's the idea. He nodded once, starting the engine. The radio crackled again, the sound cutting through the night air like static. Then before pulling away, he leaned slightly out the window and lowered his voice. As he left, the officer whispered, I can't wait to see how this ends. The letter arrived on a Thursday, stamped in bold red letters like a warning flare. Final notice. Remove all unauthorized structures within 48 hours or face legal action. I stared at it for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in my hands, and felt that familiar fire rise in my chest. Greg had pushed as far as he could, and now he thought he'd won. But what he didn't know was that the deadline he'd given me wasn't the end. It was my cue. For weeks I'd been chiseling in secret, turning stone into truth. 50 statues lined the edges of my garage, silent and waiting. Each one was a mirror Greg couldn't ignore. Each one a confession of his corruption carved in cold permanence. The moment he set that deadline, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The next morning, I made a few calls. First to Diane, then to a local reporter who'd once covered a zoning scandal in the next county over. You'll want to see this, I told her. Saturday morning, Cedar Ridge. You can't miss it. Word spread fast. Whispers moved through the neighborhood like wind through tall grass. Some people pretended not to know anything, but I saw the way they peeked through their curtains when trucks started arriving. That night, Diane helped me move the statues, one by one, onto the front lawn. By dawn, the entire property had transformed into a stone gallery of defiance. The first light of morning stretched long shadows across the grass. My hands were covered in chalk dust, my clothes streaked with gray, but I felt lighter than I had in months. When I stepped back and looked at the rows of figures, my throat tightened. They stood facing the street, life-sized replicas of every HOA board member, frozen in the poses they knew best. Greg with his clipboard, Marjorie with her finger raised, Ben with his hands shoved awkwardly in his pockets. It was eerie, poetic, and, in its own way, perfect. By 7 o'clock, people began to gather. At first, it was just a few curious neighbors. Then cars started lining the street. Cell phones flashed, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone gasped audibly when they realized who the statues represented. I didn't say a word. I just stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the crowd's expression shift, from confusion to laughter to awe. And then Greg's SUV appeared. He stepped out wearing his usual pressed khakis and that smug confidence that never seemed to crack. But when he saw them, 50 versions of his own board staring back at him, his face drained of color. For the first time, Greg Thompson didn't have words. He looked around wildly as if trying to find someone to blame for the oxygen suddenly leaving the air. This is vandalism, he sputtered. A few people in the crowd laughed. Someone yelled, "Looks just like you, Greg." Another person whispered. Finally, someone said what we've all been thinking. Greg turned toward me, his voice sharp and trembling. "You'll regret this, Claire. You've humiliated the entire community." I took a slow step down the porch stairs. "No, Greg, you did that yourself. I just gave everyone a chance to see it." For a moment, it was silent except for the clicks of cameras. The reporter I'd called stood near the sidewalk, snapping photo after photo, her eyes wide with disbelief. "This is incredible," she whispered. "You really did this all yourself?" "Every last one," I said. Behind me, the morning sun climbed higher, bathing the statues in golden light. Their shadows stretched across the street like a procession. Neighbors were now recording, posting, sharing. By the time Greg realized what was happening, half the crowd already had their phones out. "Would you stand up like this?" I said, my voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Comment below if you'd fight back when someone tries to take what's yours." The reporter smiled. "That's going to go viral," she said quietly. Greg's hands shook as he reached for his phone. He barked into it, calling someone, probably the HOA lawyer, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of laughter and clicking shutters. For the first time, I wasn't the one. Under scrutiny, he was. And then, just as I thought the moment had peaked, a voice rose from the back of the crowd. "Excuse me, ma'am?" I turned. A man in a dark gray jacket was making his way through the people, flashing a badge as he approached. The laughter died down, replaced by a wave of uneasy murmurs. He stopped a few feet from me, his expression unreadable. "County Inspector," he said, holding out the badge. "Are you Claire Harper?" The crowd went silent. Even Greg's mouth stopped moving. I nodded slowly. "Yes, I am." The inspector's gaze moved past me to the statues, then back to my face. "We need to talk." But as the crowd cheered, a county investigator stepped forward and said my name. The county investigator's visit marked the moment everything changed. Until then, it had just been me. One woman against a homeowners association that thought it was untouchable. But when that man in the gray jacket stepped onto my lawn, clipboard in hand and a camera around his neck, the story stopped being mine alone. He didn't say much at first. Just asked polite, practiced questions while taking photos of the statues. "We've had several complaints about financial irregularities in the HOA's accounts," he said finally, lowering his voice. "You wouldn't happen to have any documentation, would you?" I almost laughed. "I have a file thick enough to build another statue." That night, I spread everything across my dining table. Letters, emails, meeting minutes, fine records, all labeled and dated. He flipped through them carefully, nodding slowly, his expression tightening the further he read. "You've been keeping excellent records," he said. "You might not realize it, but you've documented more than harassment. You've documented a pattern of financial misconduct." For the first time in months, I felt the scales begin to tilt in my favor. Within a week, the county opened a formal investigation into the Cedar Ridge HOA's finances. Greg, of course, tried to downplay it. He sent out a mass email calling the investigation a routine audit prompted by misinformation. But the tone of his messages had changed. Shorter, more defensive, less confident. The man who once strutted around with a clipboard now avoided eye contact when driving by. The county's audit team worked fast. They subpoenaed bank records, vendor contracts, and payment histories. I didn't expect to hear updates, but Diane did. Her cousin worked in the clerk's office. One evening, she came to my door, her face pale with disbelief. "They found something," she whispered. "A lot of somethings." It turned out that Greg's approved landscaping vendor, Cedar Ridge Landscaping, had been double billing the HOA for years, charging the association for maintenance that never happened, inflating invoices, and pocketing the difference. Even worse, several payments had gone to a shell company registered under Greg's brother-in-law's name. When I read the preliminary report, I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't petty corruption. This was organized theft, dressed in professionalism and hidden behind bylaws. The sums were staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars drained from homeowners' fees into private accounts. The legal definition was clear. Misappropriation of HOA funds is a felony under state property law. I remember underlining that line in the printed report until the pen tore through the paper. Soon, word spread beyond Cedar Ridge. The local news picked up the story after the reporter who covered my reveal followed up. She ran a segment titled From Garden Gnome to Grand Corruption, the HOA Scandal of Cedar Ridge. My phone rang constantly that week. Neighbors, journalists, even people from other HOAs asking how I'd uncovered it. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone who had simply refused to shut up. But Greg wasn't finished. When the walls began closing in, he did what desperate men do. He lashed out. He started emailing the neighborhood, calling me a vindictive troublemaker. He told people I had hacked HOA documents, that I was colluding with outsiders. He even visited a few homes, warning residents that if they spoke to investigators, they'd face community penalties. It worked on some. Fear is a strong silencer. But others, especially those who had been quietly suffering under Greg's control, started coming forward. The county investigator told me several homeowners had agreed to testify anonymously. "He's losing his grip," he said. "People are starting to talk." There was one night I'll never forget. I was standing by my window, the statues lined up behind me like silent sentinels, when I saw Greg pacing near his SUV, phone pressed to his ear. He was shouting into it, gesturing wildly, his face flushed. For the first time, he looked small. Not powerful, not confident, just afraid. A week later, an official notice went out. The county had frozen the HOA's accounts pending full audit results. Meetings were suspended. The board was effectively paralyzed. It should have felt like victory, but instead, it felt surreal. The same man who had once tried to evict me over a garden gnome was now the subject of a criminal investigation. When Diane stopped by that evening, she looked at the statues glowing in the porch light. "You really did it," she said softly. "You exposed him." I shook my head. "No," I said. "He exposed himself. I just gave him the mirror." But it wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, I was sitting at my kitchen table, sorting through another stack of documents, when the phone rang. The caller ID said State Auditor's Office. "Ms. Harper," the voice on the other end said, "we've completed the initial phase of the investigation. There's something you should know. What we found goes way beyond Greg Thompson or your HOA." I felt the air leave my lungs. "What do you mean?" The voice hesitated. "You've uncovered a pattern across multiple associations. Same company names, same accounts, same signatures. We think this might be part of a much larger fraud network." My hand tightened around the phone as I stared at the statues through the window, their faces cold and still in the afternoon light. Then the state auditor called me. What they found went way beyond Greg. It started like any other morning. Sunlight spilling across the street, sprinklers ticking rhythmically, neighbors pretending everything was normal. But there was a tension in the air, a kind of silence that felt heavy, waiting to break. I was on my porch watering the roses when the first unmarked car rolled into Cedar Ridge. Then another. Then 3 more. Within minutes, the cul-de-sac was lined with county vehicles, their lights flashing faintly in the daylight. Agents stepped out, suits, badges, gloves, clipboards. They moved with quiet precision, like they'd rehearsed this moment. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Curtains twitched. Garage doors cracked open just enough for someone to peek out. Then came the first word that made everyone stop breathing: warrant. I stood frozen, hose still running, as 2 investigators walked up to the HOA office, a converted model home at the end of the block. They taped the warrant to the door and began carrying boxes inside. Another agent rolled a dolly stacked with file bins out to a waiting van. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel fear. I felt something deeper, justice, slow and deliberate, finally stretching its legs. The local news crews arrived within an hour. By noon, suburban HOA scandal was splashed across every local channel. Reporters clustered on sidewalks, microphones raised, asking neighbors for comment. Most declined, but a few spoke, their voices trembling between relief and disbelief. Someone must have tipped them off, because one reporter found me standing near my gate. "Are you Claire Harper?" she asked, already knowing the answer. I nodded. "Yes," I said quietly. She smiled like she'd just met the story's heartbeat. "You're the homeowner who exposed all this?" I hesitated. "I'm just the one who stopped being quiet." Behind her, the cameras panned across my yard, rows of statues gleaming in the sunlight. Overnight, what had once been labeled non-compliance had become a monument to defiance. Kids from other neighborhoods came to take photos. Someone even left flowers at the base of the statue that looked like Greg, as if paying tribute to irony itself. By evening, the board had collapsed. Greg resigned first, citing health reasons. The others followed, one by one, each statement more desperate than the last. But resignation didn't mean escape. The county froze their assets, seized their records, and announced formal charges for misappropriation and fraud. When the footage aired that night, showing Greg being led out of the HOA office under questioning, I didn't cheer. I just sat quietly in my living room, watching the man who'd once threatened to foreclose on my home struggle to keep his head high. They say karma has no timetable, but when it arrives, it moves fast. Within a week, Cedar Ridge was under temporary management. The statues were no longer violations. They were art, installations. The same neighbors who once avoided me now waved when they passed, some even stopping to thank me. Diane told me a local paper had called me the Stone Garden Rebel. I laughed until my throat hurt. Greg, however, disappeared from sight. Rumor had it his house was up for sale, his brother-in-law's company shut down, and his reputation in tatters. You'd think that would have been enough for me, that I'd finally have peace. But peace, it seems, wasn't part of Greg Thompson's vocabulary, because just as the neighborhood began to heal, just as the noise faded and the air started to feel normal again, I got another envelope in the mail. Same white paper, same neat font, same name at the bottom. Only this time, it wasn't from the HOA. It was from Greg's personal attorney. Inside was a single line, typed neatly under the letterhead: Notice of intent to file civil suit for defamation and emotional distress. I sat there for a long time, staring at it, feeling the old fire rise again. But just when peace returned, Greg filed one last lawsuit against me. Courtrooms have a smell, a mix of paper, old air, and the truth people are too afraid to say out loud. When I walked into that courtroom, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like walking back into a battlefield I'd already crossed, the echoes of every threat Greg ever made still ringing faintly in my ears. The walls were beige, the air stale, and somewhere beneath the scent of disinfectant and paper, I could smell fear, his not mine. Greg sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by a lawyer in an expensive suit who looked like he billed by the minute for every breath he took. Greg's face was pale, drawn tight, like someone who'd been living on bitterness and caffeine for weeks. Across from him, I sat with my attorney, a woman named Laura who had the kind of calm that could cut through chaos. The judge adjusted his glasses and glanced at the paperwork before him. "Mr. Thompson, you are claiming defamation and emotional distress?" Greg nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Harper's actions have destroyed my reputation. Her displays, her accusations, they've caused me public humiliation and mental anguish." Laura rose slowly. "Your Honor, if I may," she began, sliding a folder across the table. "We'd like to enter into evidence multiple documents proving Mr. Thompson's mismanagement of HOA funds, as well as audio recordings and written statements from witnesses who were directly threatened by him during the investigation." Greg's lawyer objected immediately, his voice tight. "Irrelevant to this case." The judge didn't even look up. "Overruled," Laura continued, her tone steady but firm. "Furthermore, under state HOA law, Homeowners are entitled to recover legal fees when their association, or its acting officers, operate in bad faith. Mr. Thompson's history of intimidation and financial misconduct clearly establishes that pattern. Each word she said hit like a hammer against Greg's carefully constructed image. I could see him sinking lower in his chair, fingers gripping the edge of the table. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly. My palms were sweating, but my voice didn't shake. "I never wanted any of this," I said. "I just wanted to keep a statue my father made, a symbol of peace in my own garden." Greg turned that into a war. He used rules as weapons, fear as leverage, and lies as shields. If I fought back, it wasn't to destroy him. It was to defend what was mine. For a moment, the courtroom was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioner. Even the judge seemed to pause before speaking. "Mr. Thompson," he said finally, his tone deliberate, "this court finds no merit in your claims. In fact, it appears Ms. Harper has acted well within her rights. Your suit is dismissed and you are ordered to reimburse her legal fees." The sound of the gavel hitting the block wasn't loud, but it was final. Greg didn't look at me when he stood. He just gathered his papers and walked out, shoulders hunched, the fight drained from him. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. As I stepped outside into the sunlight, the courthouse doors closing behind me, the weight of every notice, every fine, every sleepless night finally lifted. When the gavel fell, I didn't just win a case, I won my home back. Sometimes victory doesn't sound like applause. It sounds like silence on a lawn that finally belongs to you again. It's been 6 months since the verdict, and for the first time in a long time, Cedar Ridge feels alive again. The streets are quieter, not with fear but with peace. The meetings no longer feel like interrogations, and the people who once avoided me now stop to talk, to smile, to breathe easier. A new HOA board was elected last month, one that promised transparency, fairness, and something the last one never understood: decency. The first motion they passed was small but symbolic. All residents now have the right to display personal decorations, memorials, and art, as long as they're safe and respectful. When the announcement went out, the neighborhood cheered. I didn't attend that meeting, but Diane told me later that everyone knew who that motion was really for. My statues still stand on the lawn. They've weathered a little. The sun has softened their edges. The rain has left pale streaks down their faces. But they remain. People come from nearby towns to see them now. Some call them protest art, others a local landmark. I just call them truth in stone. Kids take pictures in front of them. Couples pose for engagement photos beside the statue of Greg with his ever-watchful clipboard. The irony never fails to make me smile. The same lawn they once tried to strip bare has become a monument to resistance. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evening, the air warm and still, the beast statues glowing faintly under the streetlight. I think about my father, the way his hands moved when he carved that little gnome all those years ago. He told me once that art could outlast anger if it came from a place of truth. He was right. The silence here now isn't empty, it's earned. Every bird call, every rustle of leaves feels like a reminder that peace, real peace, doesn't come from rules. It comes from standing your ground when it matters most. I never set out to be a symbol. I just refused to bow. And somehow, that was enough. They wanted to erase one gnome, but I made sure they'd never be forgotten. If you've ever stood up to power and refused to back down, this story was for you. What would you have done if your HOA tried to erase your memories? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe no one should be bullied out of their own home, share this video right now. Hit that subscribe button for more real battles, real courage, and real justice. Because sometimes the smallest stand can echo louder than any law.